Greetings from warm and humid Singapore. Great to see everyone back here, and welcome back to episode 4 of our Bridging the Gulf public education series hosted by the Middle East Institute at Singapore. So today, before I begin, I'd like to first wish our Muslim friends Eid Mubarak wa kul am wa antum bi alf khair. Or from this part of the world, we say Selamat Hari Raya Aidil Fitri. So today's episode is on Kuwait. Last week we had Saudi Arabia, and we had Miss Imana Hussein talking about Saudi Arabia. Today's episode on Kuwait will be graced by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Tahani Terkait, who's also a dear friend of mine. Now, some may ask, because Kuwait is one of the smaller Gulf states, and what is our last, interaction with Kuwait? And you may be interested to know that, back in 2006, on the 18th of November, Singapore's founding Prime Minister, in his capacity as Minister Mentor, Lee Kuan Yew visited Kuwait and delivered a keynote speech at the National Bank of Kuwait Symposium. And some of the talking points that was in his speech was about, self-reliance, about building a strong economy, regardless of the political system, whether it's democratic or dictatorial. So that was our brush with Kuwait at that time in 2006. And I suppose many of us know Kuwait through the Iraqi occupation, but do we know of what went on, that the whole intensive campaigning to liberate the country? So with that, let me share some slides to start off this introduction on Kuwait. Right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to take it back to the basics, is about the Majlis. The Majlis in the Gulf states really is a traditional community salon, a council, and it occurs at the grassroots level, but also at a more formal level where tribal chiefs and sheikhs meet other members of the society. So Majlis comes from the root Arabic verb jalasa, which means to sit. So it's traditionally, a Majlis is traditionally a male preserve when it comes to the Gulf states. And what happens is that, it's still an ongoing part of Gulf culture, in fact, Arab culture, to sit together over coffee and to discuss and exchange news. So what I wanted to say is that in Kuwait, although in the rest of the Gulf states, the Majlis is really part of, it has accomplished that achievement that lands itself in the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List. But in Kuwait, the Majlis is more affectionately known as the Diwania, or Diwan for short. So how does this relate back to Kuwait? I think we talked a bit about some of the Gulf states' maritime past and strong maritime links in the pre-oil era. And if you can see on your screen now, you see the kind of scenes that we were witnessing on the shore. So now you may ask, what has the Majlis or the Diwania got to do with that kind of maritime past? So, and the first and most direct answer really was about addressing social needs. As you can see on the right side of your screen, these were interconnected houses and very closely knit community. So we have the Diwania or the Majlis acting as a meeting point or meeting space for different stakeholders in the maritime trade. It could be the pearl divers, it could be the shipbuilders, it could be the sea captains, and so on, and the merchants. So it was really, the Majlis was a place of social need that addressed social need, because whenever a problem arises, Kuwaitis will go to their own neighborhood Diwania or Majlis. So now this practice and habit and custom continues even today. And I think they've taken it a bit further, the Majlis culture a bit further, by instilling it in political trends. And at the grassroots, we see, whenever the elections are just around the corner, we see a lot of intense campaigning. And in these, kind of intense campaigning, these are conducted in the diwaniyas, where the candidates will go around and make their rounds in different family diwaniyas and to make their case, to give a speech, and to try to convince the voters. So as you can see on your screen, and on the top left photo and the top right collage, we see female parliamentary candidates. And yes, since 2005, females are allowed to run for office in Kuwait, and they also engage in Diwania campaigning or Majlis campaigning, if you like. So this culture has gone into the political realm, and as well as it stays rooted firmly in the family. As you can see in the bottom photo, this is a photo taken by me back in 2014, where I visited one of the family Diwans sitting on a specific day of the week, and they meet regularly. Of course, now during a pandemic and during COVID-19 times, these kind of trends are going to be different. And last December, when Kuwait had held its own parliamentary elections, this was taken virtually. So now please allow me to take you back to the Iraqi occupation and how this whole Majlis culture and Diwania culture, links back to Kuwait. And we can see in these photos that, they were used as counter spaces and also spaces used by lobbying groups during the occupation itself. And the idea of a Diwania or Majlis in Kuwait was taken outside national borders. What I meant to say was that, Kuwaitis took the Diwania idea into Dubai, into London, where they set up, a meeting point for lobbying groups to campaign to liberate and free their own country from the Iraqis at this time. So after Kuwait was liberated, Diwaniyas became the precursor to a restored parliament. So it was the first step towards rebuilding the political system. But also what was more important and crucial to note was that before the Iraqi invasion, when the parliament was unconstitutionally suspended in 1986, these grassroots majlis or diwaniyas became, the alternative counter space against the government's intention for an absolute rule. So going and finalizing my introduction here before I hand it over to our distinguished guest speaker is that, we see this kind of tribal customs, that continue to be embedded and imbued in everyday social life, not just in the Gulf states, but specifically also in Kuwait, where there's a trend of consultation, which is known as shura, and there's also this whole idea about having the ruling family as the first among equals, and this kind of things governs not only social etiquette but also political behavior. And if you look at the diagram on your screen, it's kind of when this kind of majlis was in a tent layout of the past. So in a tent, in a tribal tent of the past, the sheikhs will be sitting in the inside of this tent. And the more distinguished a guest you are, the closer you are to the sheikh. So of course, the closer you are to the exit, which means of course you obviously know your level of importance. So with that, I will finish off this introduction, and then let me stop sharing my slides. And let me introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Tahani Terkait. She is a researcher on politics focusing on the Gulf and also, of course, on her home country, Kuwait. She earned her PhD from Durham University in the UK, where she defended her thesis, The Conceptual and Constitutional Underpinnings of Kuwait's System of Government. Before pursuing higher education, Dr. Terkait worked for Kuwait's public sector, serving her country as a diplomat and a consultant in public diplomacy. And she was also Kuwait's first female press attaché at the Embassy of Kuwait in Washington, DC. So it gives me great pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Tahani Terkait. Dr. Terkait, please, if you could kindly turn on your video and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Is my voice all right? Can you hear me?
Yes, but your video is not turned on.
Start my video.
Great, that's great. You might want to go full screen with your slides as well.
Sure. Well, before I start the webinar, I mean, I would like to thank you for all the effort you've been putting in organizing the series. I would like to send you all my thanks for attending this presentation, and sending you also my Eid greetings from Kuwait. It's still in the morning here, so I wish you a great afternoon. And as my friend Dr. Che, I mean, was talking about the concept of Majlis or the Diwaniyah, who he's our expert on Diwaniyahs in Kuwait. I think you mentioned a very important point here, where we are talking about things or some of the traditions we had in the past. And I am one of those believers that our past shapes our present. And today I would like to answer the 5 W's of Kuwaiti democracy. How it happened, is it really the true democracy that we know, I mean, in the Western world? How does it look like, how it started? And to start with the early, I would say, steps for Kuwait's political system. We need to start with the early ruling traditions in Kuwait. So before 1752, there was not any form of political arrangement in Kuwait. People were dealing with each other on a family basis. Laws, regulations were issued in the absence of government institutions, and different issues were solved cordially. 1752, the people of Kuwait appointed Sabah I as their first ruler. And the notables of Kuwait sought the Sheikh's residency in town while they were away on longer trips diving for pearls. His presence was a necessity to manage the town's affairs, solve internal disputes, and maintain peaceful ties with regional tribes, unlike the merchants who were constant travelers. According to Jill Crystal, about appointing Sabah I, she states the diplomatic and political skills of Sabah I helped him become a rising leader in Eastern Arabia. While the power of Bani Khalid waned, the Sheikhs of Eastern Arabia nominated him on several events to resolve any possible frictions, and he succeeded securing cordial relations with neighboring tribes. So here, I mean, one of the main reasons is diplomatic and political skills Sabah I had. According to a prominent historian in Kuwait, Saif Marzouk al-Shamlan, Mr. al-Shamlan believes that Sabah's father was known as influential and in control of his clan, while in Najd, Sabah's appointment was therefore based on his father's reputation. And here we are talking about social status. Again, according to al-Shamlan, from Sabah I to Mubarak the Great, there were not any kind of privileges that used to distinguish the Sheikh from the people of Kuwait. The Sheikh position was like the head of a tribe who was equal to his own people. Some notables of Kuwait had more power and authority than the ruler himself. So after appointing Sabah I in 1752, the notables decided to have an agreement with their own ruler. And Professor Al-Najjar coined a term for that, describing it as a joint governing tradition. So what happened exactly is that the merchants agreed that the ruler would handle the daily affairs of the small town, and the merchant would support him financially under one condition. The sheikh would consult with the merchants on major decisions. This political formula created complete interdependence between the ruler and the ruled. Financially, the ruler was dependent on the merchants. And you might ask me how. For most Kuwaitis, diving for pearls represented their main source of income. Thus, the merchants were either ship captains or pearl merchants. When Sabah was appointed, they willingly agreed to pay the ruler a portion of the extracted revenues through custom dues, bareboat taxes, and personal loans. So this is exactly how the joint governing tradition was based. It was an agreement. It was a mutual understanding between the ruler and the merchants. And this, to be honest, was the beginning, that the ruler would rule, and the merchants and the notables would get consulted. But things get different when Mubarak the Great came to power in 1896. He was regarded as an authoritarian by his people, but respected for his political intelligence and ambitions among the tribes of Arabia. During his reign, three major events changed the history of Kuwait. Number one, it's the ritual of succession. Before the reign of Mubarak, the tradition was that the wise, trustworthy, and elderly of a Sabah family convened after the death of the ruler to discuss and select the next heir, who must have been from a Sabah family, of course, regardless of his lineage. Mubarak came to power, and he decided to have his sons and great sons to be the rulers of future Kuwait. And that's why in modern time, there are two factions of a Sabah family who share the ruling. It is either from Al-Ahmed branch or a Salim branch. Breaking the tradition of joint governing was a characteristic of Mubarak al-Kabir reign. He left the notables with no longer in alliance. I mean, the notables were no longer in alliance with him. He stopped consulting with them by enforcing absolute decision and expected complete compliance. His actions, to be honest, irritated, I mean, not only the merchant, but also the working class, who expressed their resentment on several occasions at import taxes being increased. The most important thing happened in his reign was signing the Anglo-Kuwaiti Treaty, and Kuwait became a British protectorate. The treaty terminated all sorts of international competence among other leading world powers, and was the most significant achievement of Mubarak's policy. In 1915, Mubarak passed away, and his heirs were his sons, Jabir and Salim. Both followed in the footsteps of their autocratic father. However, Jabir at least reduced the rate of import taxes, but the policies stayed the same. So I tried briefly, I mean, to give you, some hints and keys about how did the ruling tradition was. So it was joint governing, then came Mubarak the Great, which he demolished this tradition. But then things happened during the reign of Mubarak's son, Sheikh Salim, in 1921. And here I called it the road to National Assembly, the road to have an elected parliament in the present time. So I always argue that, you know, the two councils preceded the Constituent Council in 1960-61 paved the way for what we call Kuwaiti democracy today. And I would like to take you in a tour about those three councils that shaped democracy in Kuwait. The first one is the Shura Council. Some locals here call it the Council of 1921. Sheikh Salim passed away in 1921, and his heir was not identified. Before his death, the notables had become increasingly critical of Salim's autocratic rule. Again, we said that he followed the steps of his father, aiming at restoring the joint governing tradition and to have a say in the town's affairs, which they missed during the reign of Mubarak and his son. The notables decided to have a reform campaign. And here the story begins. 5 elites decided to lead a reform campaign and sign a petition. It included the following appeals. The House of As-Sabah should reconcile and find a pattern for succession to avoid inter-conflicts. Secondly, the notables limited As-Sabah family to 3 nominations from Mubarak lineage. Third, the notables' decision to confront the ruling family represented a declaration that running the town's affairs could not be autocratic anymore. And they called for restoring the old tradition of joint governing. Again, so it's all about this formula of joint governing, that we need to be consulted. So the government should approve, and announce the ruler's name. The new ruler would be the head of the Shura Council, where Kuwaitis have the right to elect their representatives based on free and just elections. By consensus, As-Sabah family selected Ahmed al-Jabr to be their 10th ruler of Kuwait. And here you can see his picture. The second council is known as Council of 1938, or the Legislative Council. Here we are talking about different political scene, and the political events surrounding the 1938 council broke the alliance between the ruler and merchants and led the ruler to create new alliances with other factions in the society, mainly the tribes. Several regional and international events ignited turmoil in Kuwait, changing the political arrangement between the ruler and the merchants. Internationally, the Great Depression and the invention of Japanese cultured pearls in the late 1920s, which threatened the merchants' economic power. Again, they sell pearls, and they are merchants and shipbuilders, leading to a confrontation with the ruling family. Domestically, the oil discovery led the ruling family to change their tactics. By 1950, the ruling family had paid off its debts to the merchants and no longer would the ruler or the emirate rely on port dues paid by merchants. Moreover, increasing taxation rates and ignoring the corruption of some leading members of the ruling family complicated the political scene. The 1938 council only lasted for 6 months, unfortunately. The ruler was not pleased with the new political arrangement, yet the council immediately began to run the country finances and dispute the emir and ruling family allowances. So here we are talking about a stronger council. The first council, it was appointed. The second council still was appointed, but the members of the council changed their tactics, and they were more influential, I would say, in running the town's affairs. The last straw, when the council requested the December check for the country's oil revenues, in response, the Emir Ahmed al-Jabr dissolved it on the 17th of December in 1938. The reign of Abdullah Salim is a very important and reign for all Kuwaitis, up to date. Locals describe the 1950s as the Renaissance era of Kuwait. This was the reign of Abdullah Salim, the 11th ruler of Kuwait, known as Abu Dastur, or the father of the constitution. During his rule, which is between 1950 to 1965, Kuwait adopted one of the most liberal constitutions in the Arab world, and it's the only one in the Gulf region, and established an elected parliament in 1963. The reign of Abdullah Salim was notable for lacking the tension which the previous council had endured. He restored the balance between the government and opposition and devoted all his endeavors to the development and prosperity of Kuwait. At that time, a new wing of opposition began to emerge. It was a group of educated young men who believed in Arab nationalism, echoed the views of President Nasser of Egypt, and hailed from different social classes in Kuwait. June 19, 1961, Kuwait gained its independence and was no longer a British protectorate. Few days later, the Iraqi president, Abdul Karim Qasim, refused to accept Kuwait as a sovereign and independent state. He asserted that Iraq's sovereignty over it, and it threatened to use the force. Neither the international community nor the Arab League welcomed these developments, but the threats helped trigger Kuwait's rapid adoption of democracy. 2 months after Kuwait's independence, the Emir issued Decree 12, 1961, calling for elections to the Constituent Council. Opening session was on January 20th, 1962, and they elected 20 members. The mission of the Constituent Council was to draft, discuss, and promulgate the new constitution of Kuwait. And here, the Constituent Council is very important council in Kuwait. Number one, it was elected. The 20 members, none of them were from the ruling family. The ruling family were ministers, except for one who I will talk about later, who was a member and represented, he was the son of the Emir, member of the son of the Emir, and he was the Minister of Interior and representative of the ruling family in the Constitution Committee, which I'll talk about in a minute. Within the Constituent Council, 5 members were elected to a subcommittee known as the Constitution Committee to discuss the draft prepared by the constitutional experts from Egypt. The Constitution of Kuwait was ratified on time as scheduled on 11 of November 1962. And may I say that up to date, we celebrate every 11/11 as Yom al-Dastur, the Constitution Day here in Kuwait. Among its 183 articles, Article 6 of the Constitution of Kuwait enacts that the system of government in Kuwait shall be democratic, under which sovereignty resides in the people, the source of all powers. Sovereignty shall be exercised in the manner specified in this constitution. At the same time, the Constitution of Kuwait defines the state religion in Article 2 as the religion of the state is Islam, and the Islamic Sharia shall be a main source of legislation. And this, up to date, raise a main question. So is Kuwait a democracy, or is Sharia is a main source of legislation? Scholars conclude that what makes Kuwait's system of government unique, it's its hybridity. So when we look at the government system of Kuwait, I can argue that it is democratic, hereditary, representative, parliamentary, and influential by its Islamic and Arabic heritage. I'm not going to talk further, but I would like to conclude by saying that the development of Kuwait's political system had undergone a great leap from simple tribal shura tradition to a modern democratic parliamentary one. If you don't mind, am I good in time, Dr. Tay?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I would like to share some pictures, if that is okay. Here is the picture of Sheikh Abdullah Salim with the Speaker of the Constituent Council, Mr. Abdul Latif Al Ghanim. This is a very, a very well-known picture, in Kuwait. I'm going to share with you the colorful one. Recently, thanks to technology, they colored it. And here it's when Mr. Al Ghanim handed the last draft of the Constitution of Kuwait in 1962 in preparation for the ratification by Sheikh Abdullah Salim, the Emir of Kuwait at that time. Here, Sheikh Abdullah Salim is ratifying the first constitution of Kuwait. And here Sheikh Abdullah Salim at the Constituent Council reading the opening session. And this is the Constituent Council, the ministers and members of the members of the Constituent Council. This is the Dr. Ahmed Al-Khatib, Deputy Speaker. He is known to be one of the outspoken opposition leaders in Kuwait. And apparently he's arguing one of his main arguments that shaped really in the debates of democracy and Islamic Sharia, fighting for more freedoms and liberal perspective in the constitution. This is my last picture, which is the modern layout of Kuwait National Assembly. Thank you very much. And I'll be more than happy to start the discussion and have any question you have.
Thank you, Dr. Terkait. So now we've entered the Q&A segment of the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can of course either raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you could also enter your question in the Zoom chat box, which I can then of course read it out to Dr. Terkait. So while our audience is busy adjusting their thinking caps, please allow me to start with the first question, because Tahani, you actually gave a historical overview of what happened, and you talked a bit about how Kuwait went from the whole tribal custom of shura, joint governing, and then it hit a point where you have a sheikh who's a tribal chief who was very autocratic in his style, and then you have another two councils along the way. So, but Kuwait did not, for this period of time, did not actually adopt, or embrace democracy during this period. So it seems that what pushed them down this path was external forces, and by external forces I'm saying the Abdul Karim Al-Qasim in Iraq. And could you tell us a bit more about this, and also in the 90s with the Iraqi occupation, how did that change the dynamics in terms of Kuwaiti politics? So there's two Iraqi claims on Kuwait and two periods of time, which I assume that there will be different circumstances. So how have things changed from then to the 90s? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Che. In 1962, it wasn't only the claims of Qasim of Iraq. So I would say it accelerates things, it expedites things, and it urged the government and the opposition to form a coalition and to put the national interest of Kuwait and Kuwait sovereignty as a priority. So, but we cannot also, undermine the movement of reformists, those nationalists, the opposition, which started, in 1921, and it continued in 1938. And it developed, to 1962, where we had an elected council preparing Kuwait to take its first steps to a modern, independent, democratic state. So I need, this is about 1962 and the claims of Qasim. In 1991, we need, unfortunately, in 1986, the parliament was dissolved, and this is 4 years before the invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. So in the absence of the parliament, these regional developments happened. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait for 7 months, and the opposition blamed the government for silencing their voices and not allowing them, if you would call it, the joint government. So again, in 1986, the joint government was demolished. It was cut again. So in the absence, I mean, again, in 1990, when the government and the opposition met in Jeddah, and they decided, to have a coalition and alliance again, with the promises from the government of Kuwait that when Kuwait gets liberated, the parliament is going to be restored and more freedoms would be secured. And this is what happened. And I think there is a lesson here. The history of Kuwait and the three council I talked about earlier, gave us a lesson that whenever, the joint governing, this mutual understanding between the government and the parliament is absent, we are faced with a turmoil of political instability, absence of the main form of representation in Kuwait, and complications would happen.
Thank you, Dr. Terkait. I think we have a couple of questions in. I think we got the audience warmed up now. So we have one. The first question is from Yo Chen Zi, where he asked, what happens to the merchant-ruler equation that you talked about, that the ruler relied on the notables and merchants for finance? Where do these merchants stand now? Are they in the pro-government camp or anti-government camp? So let's just start with this question first before I move on to the next.
That's a very interesting question. Well, the merchants at the beginning, the sheikhs used to be reliant, or dependent financially on they were reliant financially on the merchants. During the reign of Ahmed al-Jabir, it was the oil discovery. So there were a new, the whole calculation has changed. So the sheikhs are no longer in need of the merchants. So what they have is they have the oil revenues and they become independent, financially. That's why, I mentioned something about paying off their debts, and they're no longer in need of the sheikhs. After, during the reign of Abdullah Salim, things has changed. Abdullah Salim came as a friend of the opposition, and the political institution has emerged. So there were more, I would say, the alliance was with the merchants not very stable. So it was always up and down between the merchants. Nowadays, if I'm going to talk about, today at the present time, no, there is this alliance between the government and the merchants. But before, it was broken. And that's why the Sheikh, Ahmed al-Jabir, he started, to have alliances with a new faction of the society, and mainly the tribes. So it was up and down. It depends on who's the emir. But since, the oil discovery, since 1936, the whole thing has changed, and the merchants are kind of, I'm not going to say they are not neglected at the moment. And this is we can talk about this in another lecture. But however, at that time in the 30s to the 1961, the whole thing has changed.
Thank you, Tahani. And you talked a bit about Sheikh Abdullah Salam as the Emir was considered the father of the constitution. And so we have a question here, another question from our audience, Elizabeth Monnier, who says, I would be interested to hear more about the question of Islam being the official religion and Sharia as the principal law. Could you summarize the arguments for and against? Also, could you give a sense of how controversial this was during the constitution drafting process? Who were the main opponents to including this in the constitution? So that's quite a heavy one.
Do you mind, Dr. Che, to repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, that was, who were the main opponents to including this in the constitution, including the Sharia as the principal law in the constitution? I think that was her question.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. It's I must say that the debate of democracy and Sharia, I mean, I always say that it's democracy versus Sharia. It is an ongoing debate, up to date. As Kuwait identified itself as an Arab Muslim state, at the same time, it was the only country in the Gulf region to adopt a liberal constitution, a democratic constitution. So are we a full democracy, like the same democracy you find in Europe, for instance, or in the States? We are not. We are a hereditary emirate. So it is more of a constitutional monarchy. So there is a constitution and there is a parliament. But there are a lot of, I mean, I would say Kuwait custom made its own political system, its own democracy, meaning that it needed at that time in 1961, after the independence, Kuwait decided to have the democracy. And I argued this in depth in my research, in my PhD thesis, that democracy was something very new. So there was this debate that we are a conservative country, we are a Muslim country. Would this contradict with our beliefs, with our traditions? Some members thought that yes, it might. Others, I mean, find it that it would be a great thing to take the country forward. So there was this compromise in drafting the Constitution of Kuwait. And that's why, I mean, like when you read the articles of the Constitution, you might be confused. At the same time, it is considered unique because it is a combination of all those traditions and systems. According to the Constitution of Kuwait, members of parliament and the government have the right to amend the Constitution after 5 years of its drafting, after its ratification. And the reformists at that time were promised, because the speaker, I mean, I posted his picture, the deputy speaker, I mean, Dr. Al-Khatib, for instance. He wasn't happy with the conclusion, with everything, I mean, with the last draft of the Constitution. Yet, there were these promises that, okay, the future will bring more freedoms, more openness to the Constitution. So we are still, I mean, we are still divided between people who want to restrict the current Constitution of Kuwait, which had never been amended before. And still there are those voices that we are ready to have a more progressive, a more liberal constitution. Now I forget about who are the opponents. Who are the opponents? It's again, who are the opponents of, I would say, more opponents? It's those who are threatened by modernity. It is by those who find that any steps further towards more freedoms, it's kind of restriction to the religion or distortion of the religion and the Kuwaiti traditions. But to be honest, I do find that there are some moderate voices at the moment that would like to balance between both. And this is what we are working on at the moment in Kuwait, that we are trying to balance things. Nobody wants, I mean, like being Arabic as my language, being Islam as my religion. I don't find it a threat or a contradiction to be a democratic country. Still, as I mentioned earlier, that Kuwaiti democracy, it was designed to its culture, to its traditions. And I advise you to read the Constitution. You will find it very interesting.
Thanks, Tahani. We got another question that builds on this whole hybridity of the system. Yes. And this comes from Brian Chang. And his question is, building on the last question, how has Kuwait's hybrid Sharia democracy addressed gender issues such as triple talaq divorce, violence against women, etc.? And I think this is a very, you know, this is an issue that's been a hot topic, you know, of late. So I hand it over to you.
It is. I mean, it is a very important issue. And Article 29, and I'm having the Constitution within my hands. I'm reading this now. Article 29 states all people are equal in human dignity and in public rights and duties before the law, without distinction as to race, origin, language, or religion. And by the way, we always use Article 29 as, even when in gender issues, to be honest, as a justification, and not a justification, as an evidence that the Constitution of Kuwait gave men and women all equal rights. So this article should end discrimination and provide all citizens of Kuwait equal rights.
Thanks again, Tahani. We've got another question from Valerie Go, and this is, I think, is a very generic question about, the late Sheikh Sabah. And could you describe the ruling style of the late Sheikh, and what was the harmony in the relationship between the parliament and the government back then?
Of the late Sheikh Sabah, right?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. Could you describe the ruling style of the late Sheikh Sabah, and was there any harmony between the parliament and the government during his time?
The reign of Sheikh Sabah, I mean, he is, I talked about Sheikh Abdullah Salim, and people of Kuwait call him Abu Dastur, the father of constitution. Sheikh Sabah is known to be the father of humanity. So he is he is known for his diplomatic endeavors internationally. He was awarded the humanitarian award from the UN for all the humanitarian work he had performed during his reign. At the same time, domestically, and not only during the reign of Sheikh Sabah, it was always, there is this friction and tension between the government and the parliament. So when I look at the history from 1967, the first dissolution of the parliament, I would say that there were more than 11 dissolutions of the parliament. So there is a sense of political instability. And this goes back to other reasons, has to do, some realize this to the laws that are outdated. There were some calls for amending the constitution, and some voices was towards, restricting the constitution instead of liberating the constitution and give, the state and its people more freedom. So briefly, I would say that the relationship, it's always, it's tense. And I'm working on something related to political instability and why Kuwait was having a lot of dissolutions in the past 2 decades or so.
Thanks, Tahani, and I'm sure you're also aware of the recent, tensions between the two branches of government, and of course a lot of personality attacks as well. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. This comes from my colleague, Dr. Asif Shudra, and he says, your position as Kuwait's first female press attaché at the embassy in the US makes you an important part of Kuwait's journey of democratization, especially in terms of gender equality. Could you please share more of such experience and how such developments in Kuwait itself have influenced the liberalization efforts in other GCC countries?
Well, thank you very much for this question. And it's, I don't think I am part of, I really wish that I am, someone who would bring more liberty and more freedom and gender equality to the political scene in Kuwait. But I must say that I served in Washington, D.C. between 2001 to 2007. At that time, women did not vote. So I gained this position as the first female press attaché. So I have this diplomatic status, but at that time, I couldn't vote. I never voted. And one of the major files I worked on during my tenure in DC was women's rights, Kuwaiti women's rights, which I had the honor to work on, to be honest. It was challenging as a woman, like to have the diplomatic status and, I mean, this important job. At the same time, I mean, you don't have the political influence where you can run for parliament or at least cast your vote every 4 years. But at the same time, I was fortunate that I worked with some seniors who believed in women's rights and empowering women. So my mentor, Professor Shafiq Gabra, who was the head of Kuwait Information Office that time, I mean, believed that empowering women was a very important time before even, you know, women got the right to vote. So we need to empower women professionally, paving the way for them, that we need to see them, I mean, like occupying high position in order to give them and pave the way for them to be involved in more in politics and in the political scene, mainly running for parliament and casting the vote. So this is how, I mean, hopefully I answered your question, but the journey, I mean, my journey didn't stop over there. To be honest, after the PhD, it makes it more challenging. And now I'm based in Kuwait. So it is women empowerment is still, I have a big question mark on it. I think I will give Kuwait the credit for giving women, I mean, like the presidency and being the first press attaché, the first ambassador, the first, I mean, physician, the first engineer. But I would like to see more empowerment for women in all fields. So we don't need to stop at one field. I would like to see many press attachés, many diplomats, which is happening, to be honest. But I would be a bit selfish since your colleague mentioned the question. And I would like to see more women empowerment, especially that when it comes to population, we are the majority, not our counterparts.
Thanks again, Tahani. We've got time for a couple more questions, and there's one more from our audience, from Selena Tan. So her question is, in the immediate post-Iraqi occupation period, how challenging was it to restore the political system according to the constitution set out in the early 60s?
To be honest, I don't find it, and this is my personal point of view, I don't think it was challenging, because it was promising for the opposition in 1990 that when Kuwait get liberated, we will restore the parliament. The constitution of Kuwait enacts that parliament should be in progress every 4 years. Every 4 years, there should be elections. So before the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, I think the constitution was put on hold and it was inactivated. So after the invasion, the ruling family, the Emir of Kuwait, the late Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed, promised that the parliament would be restored, and according to the constitution of Kuwait, it was enacted simultaneously, directly, on spot.
Thanks again. And the next question comes from me, because it suddenly came to my mind that I was asked this question, a couple of weeks back about, the current situation in Kuwait, and the fact that there has been infighting between the parliament and the government. But does politics, have an impact on the business? If you want to go into Kuwait and do business, does this kind of situation, affect the business ecosystem. So all yours.
It's not only affecting the business in Kuwait. I think it's affecting our lives as locals too. So it's the harmony between and the cooperation between the two powers, the legislative and the executives, is very important. And this is what we are aiming at as nationals. This tension is affecting the prosperity and the development of the country at the moment. And I do see this affecting the businesses. The government is giving a lot of promises, and I do see some changes in that perspective. But again, there is this sense of instability, insecurity when it comes to domestic politics. And I think, since you mentioned this, I think I didn't want to go in details, but there is something about separation. I mean, like in politics, we have separation of powers. And the powers, each power should be independent, and there shouldn't be any interference among the three powers. And there is this thing about how do we see our democracy? What is our definition of democracy? And this takes me back also, I mean, like to one of the audience, I think it was Elizabeth, asked about not the harmony, I mean, about the two powers. It's very complicated that when we don't know whether we are a full democracy or we are not. There is, and here we are talking about identity issues, like does democracy means that we are still a democratic a Muslim country? Would this violate any of the Islamic traditions? Would this violate any of I mean, like the Arab traditions? And I always argue that we need to mature our definition of democracy in order to have this stability. I blame, I mean, our the way we choose our representatives. So are we choosing them based on a tribal, based on social, cordial relationships? I mean, or we are choosing the right candidate because he is going to be the right representative, the qualified representative or member of parliament. And this is one of many reasons that I don't want to go on at the moment, but it is about how we define our political system. And you mentioned earlier about this thing about there is a lot of like personal disputes. So it's not about political things. It's not about how the powers are separated. How are we enacting the articles of the Constitution? It is more now, sometimes all the disputes at the parliament, more or less, it's about personal stuff, about political agendas. And this is, we didn't see this, after the liberation. We didn't see this in 1962 when the members of the Constituent Council drafted the Constitution. We are not seeing any kind of compromising, I mean, any harmony between the two powers. Yet, I still believe in it. As a Kuwaiti, as a scholar, I'm aiming in my field as a responsible citizen to restore, I mean, not to restore, I mean, like to work so hard to mature our definition of democracy and to protect it, of course.
Thank you. Thank you again. So we have one final question from the audience, and this is from Amir Hassan Monajemi. And his question is it right to think that after the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, the country's foreign policy has become more isolated and less involved in the regional affairs? Of course, I could immediately respond to this, but let me add a second part to this question. I would say is that, how far has Kuwait looked eastwards towards Asia, since the invasion, towards China? And we all know that, this has been a a big headlines, recently. So two parts, has Kuwait become more isolated after the invasion, and how far has it looked eastwards? All yours.
I don't think that, I totally disagree, to be honest. If I was talking about the domestic instability, political instability. On the contrary, I think Kuwait's foreign policy is very stable, very progressive. And I think the invasion gave us the platform to foster more relationships with countries worldwide. That's why I don't have the number at the moment, but I am positive that the number of embassies worldwide, Kuwaiti embassies worldwide, had enlarged. And as a matter of fact, I mean, there was this debate a while ago about, like, why are we going that far all over the world? And we need to reconsider, I mean, like, to lessen the number of embassies overseas. So the first part, I totally disagree. I think the invasion gave us a lesson that diplomacy prevails. And if it wasn't for Kuwait's foreign policy, Kuwait won't be liberated. And that's a fact. What was the second part? How far we went with
looking eastwards towards Asia?
It had always been very strong. And I think it's even after the invasion, it became stronger. Before the invasion, you barely would hear that we'd have scholarship in China, in South Asia. Now we have students all over the world, you name it. And now, as a diplomat, if you work in public diplomacy and international relations, it would be a credit for you if you speak Chinese, if you speak Japanese, if you know what I mean. So I think there was this expansion, not only in Asia, worldwide. And I don't think Kuwait wanted to change this policy. I think, as I said, and I repeat, that Kuwait's foreign policy is more stable, it's more advanced when I compare it to internal politics.
Thank you again, Tahani. So we have come to the end of our 1-hour episode on Kuwait, and that was a really lively and robust discussion, a really good Q&A segment, if I may add. And so thank you to our audience for providing us with the questions. And also, of course, I have to thank sincerely our speaker for today, Dr. Tahani Terkait, for gracing us with a knowledge on the Kuwait's domestic politics and also answering the questions from the audience. So with that, I would like to wish everyone Eid Mubarak, of course. And I'll see you all 2 Fridays from now on the next episode on Oman. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, Clemens. Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me.